They thought the case was closed until the dog leapt onto the witness stand and uncovered a blood-stained letter hidden beneath the bench, signed by a soldier long presumed dead. Days later, he led police to a missing boy inside an abandoned warehouse. And when he pulled a voice recorder from the killer's jacket in court, the voice of the fallen echoed through the room. Kali, this isn't the story of a man, but of a dog who carried the truth across years of silence. If you're here now, leave a like, hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. What part of his journey made you stay. The rain whispered down softly on the worn stone steps of Jackson County Courthouse, casting a silver sheen over the early morning gloom. Wind tugged gently at the long black coat of Malik Thompson as he stepped from the idling city bus, his boots sinking slightly into the shallow puddles left behind by the spring drizzle. In his right hand he held a worn leather leash, its clasp open. Empty. People on the sidewalk barely noticed the older black man making his slow, deliberate way up the courthouse stairs. Perhaps they saw the rigid line of his jaw, the calm but heavy way he moved, or maybe they simply didn't see him at all. But Malik wasn't there for them. He had waited 4 years for this day. He passed through the metal detector in silence, nodding politely to the young security officer who barely looked up. Inside the courthouse lobby, time seemed frozen. The lights were too bright, the air too clean, everything too quiet. Malik paused before the double doors leading into courtroom B. From beyond them came the murmurs of voices, the creak of benches, the rustle of cheap suits and legal folders. He breathed in once, deeply, then stepped inside. Rows of strangers turned toward him as he entered, not out of recognition but curiosity. An older black man, face lined like a map of grief, carrying an empty leash. What did he matter here? Just another father mourning a son no one could bring back. He walked to the back bench and sat without a word. The wooden seat groaned under his weight. In his mind, he was already far away 4 years and 10,000 nightmares ago. The judge's bench loomed ahead. Lawyers shuffled notes. Bailiffs eyed the defendants. And there they were, the 5 bikers in orange jumpsuits, chained together like animals. Troy Maddox sat in the center, his hair longer now, streaked with gray. But Malik recognized him instantly. His son Elijah had trusted that man. A low rumble, a flicker of motion near the rear doors. Then silence, the kind of silence that comes before something breaks. Suddenly a crash, the courtroom doors flung open. A collective gasp echoed as a large black and tan German shepherd bolted into the room, soaked to the bone, eyes blazing with something far beyond instinct. The dog didn't bark. He didn't pause. He moved like memory, raw, painful, exact. People recoiled in surprise as the dog's shadow padded down the center aisle, water dripping from his fur onto the floor, nails clicking against the old wood. He didn't look at anyone. His focus was narrow. He walked until he reached the witness stand, then stopped. His ears stood up. His chest rose and fell. Then he sat down like he had always belonged there. The courtroom froze. A bailiff moved to restrain him, but Malik rose slowly from the bench. He spoke for the first time, voice steady and low. "Don't. He's not here to hurt anyone." The judge frowned. "Sir, do you know this animal?" Malik nodded. "His name is Shadow. He served with my son. He disappeared years ago, and now he's back." Whispers surged through the room. A journalist in the back raised her phone. The biker defendants turned, Troy Maddox paling at the sight of the dog. The Shadow didn't react to the noise. He turned toward the empty witness chair and sniffed. Then slowly, deliberately, he raised a paw and scratched at the cushion. Once, twice. Then he growled a deep, resonant warning. The judge looked around, confused. "What's he doing?" Malik's voice was a whisper. "He's trying to speak." A clerk stepped forward cautiously, reached under the seat cushion, and pulled out a folded, water-stained envelope. Everyone leaned forward. The judge motioned for the envelope to be handed up. With gloved hands, the clerk opened it. Inside a single sheet of paper, the ink faded, the words shaky but clear. A confession, signed with a date matching the day Elijah Thompson vanished. Malik closed his eyes. Outside, the rain picked up again, drumming softly on the courthouse windows. Shadow lay down on the floor, resting his head on his paws, gaze fixed on Troy Maddox. Malik sat down slowly, the leash still in his hand. He didn't need to say anything more. The dog had already said it all. The silence that followed the discovery of the envelope was thick and unnatural, like the air had been sucked out of the room. No one moved, no one spoke. The judge held the single sheet of paper in his gloved hands, his brow furrowed as he read silently. The only sound was the rain outside, now steady and insistent, as if tapping to be let in. Shadow remained lying on the floor, but his eyes never left the row of defendants. Specifically, he stared at the man in the middle, Troy Maddox. Troy had gone pale, his hands clenched into trembling fists on the defense table. His eyes darted back and forth, like a man cornered, searching for an escape route in a room with none. Mally, still standing near the back, watched him with a gaze carved from stone. He remembered that face, that walk, that grin behind dust-streaked goggles in Fallujah, a ghost of a man who had once been his son's commanding officer. Someone Elijah had looked up to, followed, trusted with his life. The judge finally broke the silence. This letter, it's dated 4 years ago, signed by an Elijah Thompson. It references a covert operation in Fallujah, mentions betrayal, names. He looked up sharply. Maddox, your name appears 3 times. Troy didn't respond. His attorney placed a firm hand on his shoulder, whispering urgently, but Troy brushed him off and stood, knocking over the chair behind him. This is a setup, he snapped, his voice too loud. That dog, he wasn't supposed to be here. This whole thing is a damn circus. The judge raised a hand. Mr. Maddox, control yourself. But Troy wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on Shadow now, wide and wild. He should have died over there. They both should have. Elijah and that damn He just rose slowly to his feet, walked forward until he reached the wooden witness stand again, and scratched once more deliberately, precisely at the base. A soft thud followed. Another bailiff approached, hesitant, as if stepping near the dog might trigger something primal. He knelt, reached under the platform, and pulled free a torn scrap of cloth military-issue camo, frayed and bloodstained, clutched tightly around another folded note. The judge motioned for it. The courtroom held its collective breath as he unfolded the second page. This one was written in the same scrawled, panicked hand. He left me, he read aloud. Troy said we'd be covered, that the drone was watching, but when the ambush hit, they ran. I stayed. Shadow stayed. We held the line for 6 hours. I'm not sure we'll make it. If you find this, tell my father I tried to be the man he raised. Tell him it wasn't an accident. They knew. The judge's voice faltered slightly. Another woman whispered a prayer. Troy's attorney reached for him again, but Troy pushed him away violently, then shouted across the courtroom, "You think that proves something that could have been planted?" He was weak. He froze. I told him to fall back and he stayed. That's on him. Malik didn't flinch. His voice, when it came, was quieter than before but carried further. He stayed because he believed in you, because you told him you had his back. The judge's gavel slammed down twice. Order in the court, he barked. Mr. Maddox, sit down or you will be removed. But Troy's eyes had lost all sense of presence. He looked haunted, like the ghost of Fallujah had finally caught up to him after all these years. His hands trembled as he slowly lowered himself into his seat, mouth tight, knuckles white. Shadow returned to Malik. In that moment, Malik placed his hand on the dog's head, not with command or ownership, but with understanding. He remembered, Malik whispered, not to the court but to himself. All these years, he never forgot. The judge ordered the court to recess, but no one moved at first. Eventually, people began to murmur, shifting in their seats. The bikers were escorted out under heavier security. One of them, a lanky redhead with trembling fingers, wouldn't stop staring at Shadow, as if recognizing something deeper, not just the dog but the story behind its eyes. Malik remained still, his hand resting gently on Shadow's back. He wasn't surprised by any of this. Not the letter, not the hidden cloth, not even the fear in Troy's eyes. He had seen it once before, back when Elijah came home from his first deployment and told him, "Dad, not all enemies wear different uniforms." Now that same truth had made itself known in open court. But Malik knew this wasn't over. Not yet. There were questions unasked, secrets unspoken. Why had the letter been hidden? Who placed it there? Why now? Shadow had more to say. The past was only beginning to unspool, and justice was just beginning to stir. When the court resumed session after recess, the energy in the room was palpably different. Heavier, like the weight of what had just been unearthed refused to settle. People whispered behind hands, eyes flickering toward Malik and Shadow, then toward the defense table where Troy Maddox now sat hunched forward, face pale and jaw clenched, as though trying to swallow a truth he'd long buried. The judge called the court to order once again, his voice firmer now, edged with the kind of solemnity that only comes when justice begins to rise from the dead. "We will resume with the contents of the second envelope," he said, his gaze sweeping the room. "The clerk has submitted an electronic device found wrapped in the fabric beneath the witness stand, a USB drive marked with military code." A technician from the court's evidence team approached, carefully inserting the drive into the courtroom projector system. The screen that usually displayed legal slides flickered briefly, then turned black. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the screen lit up. The footage was grainy, tinted in the eerie green hues of night vision. The image bounced slightly, as if captured by a handheld camera or helmet cam. A date stamp in the corner read, Fallujah FOB 7/19. The sound of wind, of chains, of dogs barking echoed through the speakers. Then the first image stabilized: 3 men in tactical gear, standing in front of a metal shipping container. Inside, the silhouette of a dog could be seen chained to a wall. The animal barked, not aggressively but in pain, each movement against the chain scraping metal. One of the men laughed. Another nudged the camera toward the dog. "Too soft," a voice muttered. "He doesn't break easy, does he?" The figure to the left stepped forward. He was larger than the others, broader shoulders, and he wore a mask, black, featureless. Even before the footage zoomed slightly and caught a glimpse of a tattoo peeking out from under his sleeve, the courtroom had begun to react. "Pause," the judge ordered, his voice sharp. The technician froze the frame. The prosecution attorney stood. "Your Honor, we'd like to call attention to the timestamp and request the witness identify this man." The camera's angle now revealed a clearer view, though the face was obscured. The posture, the gait, even the way he gestured to the others was damning. "Defense, does your client deny being present in this footage?" the judge asked. Troy's lawyer hesitated, full of something bitter. "They were training," he said through gritted teeth, "necessary for combat readiness. They knew what they signed up for." "They?" The prosecutor shot back. "You're referring to the dogs, or the men in your unit?" Malik didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Shadow, seated silently at his side, hadn't moved since the video began, but his eyes were fixed on the screen. His chest rose and fell slowly. He was watching not as an animal but as a witness. And Malik, watching him, saw it. The subtle tightening of the jaw, the shift in weight, the flicker in those dark eyes when the footage showed a dog not unlike Shadow himself, being shocked, restrained, forced to crawl under gunfire. Another angle this time, closer. A makeshift ring lit with floodlights, circled by men with tattoos, some wearing partial fatigues, others biker jackets. A dog stood in the center, ribs visible, eyes wild. Someone outside the frame shouted a command. The dog flinched, then charged at a padded decoy. The crowd erupted in cheers. Malik's fists clenched around the edge of the bench. He had seen this before. Not exactly this scene, but the result. Elijah had once told him stories of men who crossed lines, who created their own war inside the war. "The enemy's not always over the wall, Dad," he'd said. "Sometimes he sleeps next to you." On screen, the masked man reappeared, pulling the leash of another German shepherd toward the ring. This dog didn't flinch. It stared directly into the camera for a beat, calm, alert, intelligent. The timescape, the next frame showed blood on the sand. A different dog lying limp, laughter in the background, then static. The screen cut to black. No one spoke. The judge leaned forward slowly. "Is there more?" The technician nodded. "Yes, sir, one more segment." The video resumed, this time a different angle. Low, shaky, almost hidden, it showed a row of cages behind a canvas wall. Dogs inside, some injured, some dead. And in the background, that same voice. "Clean up. No one sees this. We say it was enemy fire." The camera tilted slightly, capturing a reflection in a broken mirror nailed to the post. A face. Not masked, not blurred. Troy Maddox. Younger but clearly him, smirking as he walked out of frame. The room exhaled collectively. Troy's attorney stood to object, but the judge waved him down. "Save it for Cross," he said coldly. Malik didn't look away from the screen, but he placed his hand gently over Shadow's shoulder. "You saw this," he murmured, his voice breaking. "You remember." Shadow turned to look at him, and in those eyes, Malik saw something both devastating and unmistakable: recognition. Not just of the moment, but of the choice, of what had happened, of who had survived and who hadn't. The court adjourned briefly, giving time to log the footage as evidence, but the air in the room didn't shift back to normal. It stayed charged, as if some unspeakable truth had been breathed into the walls. And even though the judge had called recess, not until anyone explained why those dogs were there, what the hell Troy was doing, and why that footage had never surfaced until now. The USB drive sat on the clerk's desk, still warm from the projector. Malik watched it, heart pounding as though it might start speak next. Shadow hadn't moved. He simply stared at the door where Troy had exited moments before, tail low, ears forward, eyes lit with something ancient and painful and unforgiving, as if he knew this wasn't the end of what he had come to say. The air outside the courthouse that evening felt different, as if the weight of what had been revealed in the video footage had followed everyone home. Rain clouds hung low, not yet breaking but heavy with promise. The world seemed to hold its breath. Malik had stayed longer than most, sitting on the bench just outside the building, Shadow lying quietly at his feet, unmoving since the last image disappeared from the projector. Even as the courthouse lights dimmed and the parking lot emptied, neither man nor dog stirred. But when Malik finally rose to go home, Shadow didn't follow. He remained still, gaze pointed toward the horizon as if locked onto something unseen. Malik turned and knelt, whispering softly, "Come on, boy. It's over for today." But Shadow didn't move. He stared. Then, without a sound, he stood taut and padded off into the night. Malik called his name once, then again louder, but the dog had already disappeared into the shadows of the city, blending in like a ghost returned to the battlefield. Malik didn't sleep that night, not well anyway. Every creak in the house pulled his attention to the door. Every passing siren made his fingers twitch toward his phone. He waited until dawn broke, gray and brittle, before calling the local canine rescue, the police department, the shelters, anyone who might have seen a German shepherd moving through the dark alone. Nothing. He drove the perimeter of town twice, windows down despite the morning chill, calling out into the still streets. "Shadow, Shadow, come home." Only silence answered. At 6:42 a.m., his phone buzzed. Number. When he answered, a boy's voice came through, small, shaky but urgent. "Are you the man looking for the dog named Shadow?" Malik sat upright in his truck. Yes, I am. Where are you, son?" A pause. Then the boy whispered, "He's with me. He saved me." 35 minutes later, Malik arrived on the outskirts of the industrial district, where a row of abandoned warehouses stood crumbling like forgotten teeth. Police tape hung limp from one of the doors, flapping softly in the wind. A rusted sign above read, "Harlan Distribution Center, closed since 2007. Malik didn't hesitate. He parked crooked, left the engine running, and sprinted toward the source of the barking. There, in front of the third warehouse from the corner, Shadow stood, his body rigid, head raised high, barking rhythmically, insistently. Not frantic, not panicked. Purposeful. Shallow. Malik called, breath catching in his throat. The dog turned briefly, acknowledged him with a flick of the ears, then barked again, this time facing the large steel doors chained shut with a length of cable. Malik approached, noticing now the scratches along the ground, small handprints in the dust, and the faintest smear of red near the lock. He yelled back to the street, waving at the patrol car that had followed him. "Here, we need bolt cutters now." Within minutes, officers had the chain cut, and the doors groaned as they swung open. The smell hit first old oil, mildew, and something sour. Malik stepped inside alongside two officers, flashlights cutting through the dimness. "Clear left," one officer said. "Moving right," said the other. Then, from behind a stack of wooden pallets, a noise soft, almost a whimper, Shadow darted past them, nosing into the gap between crates. His tail wagged once, slowly, then froze. "Got something," the officer murmured. Malik hurried over, heart pounding. There, curled in the corner, was a small boy no older than 10, dirty, shaking, eyes wide with fear and disbelief. His arms were wrapped around Shadow's neck, clutching like his life depended on it. "He's okay," Malik said, gently kneeling. "Hey there, kid. You're safe now." The boy looked up slowly, his voice barely more than a breath. "He found me 3 nights ago. I was scared." Malik swallowed hard. "What's your name?" "Caleb," the boy said. "I've been missing, I don't know how long, I think 3 months. My mom, she tried to hide me from the man that hurt her. But he came anyway." The officers exchanged grim looks. Malik looked at Shadow, who was still pressed against the child protectively, not moving. "He didn't let anyone near me," Caleb continued. "Not even when someone came looking. They had loud voices. He growled and barked until they left. He watched me all night, every night." One of the officers stepped outside to radio it in. Malik placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "He's good at that, watching over people. He used to do it for my son." The boy blinked, then leaned into Shadow, burying his face in the thick fur. The German shepherd made a low, soft sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a sigh. Something that spoke of tiredness, of having held too much inside. Paramedics arrived minutes later. Caleb was examined, wrapped in a blanket, and placed into the back of the ambulance. But when they tried to coax Shadow away, the dog refused to leave the boy's side. Only when Caleb whispered, "It's okay now. I'll be safe." did Shadow rise slowly and step back, his eyes still locked on the boy, until the ambulance door closed. Malik stood there, watching it drive off, his heart thudding against his ribs. Questions surged. How had Shadow found the boy? Why this warehouse? Why now? He looked down at the dog, who had once again returned to his side, panting lightly but eyes sharp. Malik knew something deeper was at play. Shadow hadn't just stumbled onto Caleb, he had tracked him, chosen him, the same way he had done for Elijah, the same way he now seemed determined to do for the truth. But Caleb wasn't the only one Shadow had been watching. That warehouse, that location, something about it gnawed at the edges of Malik's mind. Then, the courthouse returned to session the next day, with tension woven into every breath and glance exchanged across the room. The story of Shadow's discovery at the warehouse and the missing boy he guarded had already rippled through local news and public conversation like a storm front. But the courtroom itself had become a kind of sacred ground where revelations unfolded not through witnesses or lawyers, but through the actions of a dog who refused to be silenced. Malik sat in the front row this time, no longer a passive presence in the shadows, but a pillar holding a quiet truth in his spine. Shadow was at his feet, calm, motionless, yet entirely alert. He had been that way since returning from the warehouse, as though he were waiting not for orders, but for a precise moment only he could feel coming. Troy Maddox was back in his seat at the defense table, his expression more hardened than ever, though the glint of uncertainty had begun to show around the edges of his demeanor. He no longer looked out at the courtroom defiantly. Instead, his eyes often drifted toward Shadow, and when they did, a flicker of something sharp, panic, recognition, or guilt briefly crossed his features before vanishing beneath a practiced mask. The prosecutor was mid-questioning a witness about Troy's whereabouts during the days surrounding Elijah Thompson's last known transmission. When Shadow suddenly rose, it was not a twitch or accidental movement. It was deliberate, charged, like something within him had switched from stillness to purpose. The judge looked over, surprised, but said nothing. Everyone turned to look. Shadow's gaze locked on Troy, his ears angled forward, body lowering into a slow, tense crouch. Malik noticed immediately. "Shallow," he whispered gently, but the dog didn't break focus. He took 2 steps forward. Then 3. Troy stiffened. "Get that damn dog out of here," he snapped at the bailiff, his voice cracking ever so slightly. But before anyone could move, Shadow lunged, not to attack, not with violence, but with precision. In a single leap, he landed squarely against Troy's chest, his front paws pinning the man backward into his chair. Chaos erupted, but not from aggression. Shadow didn't bite or snarl. Instead, his jaws clamped onto Troy's jacket pocket and tugged violently, ripping the fabric. Something small and black tumbled out, bounced once on the floor, and landed with a metallic clink that silenced the room. It was a voice recorder. Troy froze. His attorney swore under his breath. The dog had already stepped away, calmly returning to Malik's side like a soldier completing a mission. The judge stood, expression unreadable. "Secure that device," he ordered. The prosecutor picked it up, examined it quickly, then held it toward the technician. "Let's hear it," the judge said, his voice low. The speakers crackled. Static. Then a voice. Young, male, ragged with exhaustion, but unmistakably human. "This is Corporal Elijah Thompson," it began. Gasps rippled across the room. Malik's breath caught in his throat. The voice continued, "If anyone hears this, I want it known I didn't die from enemy fire. I didn't die because someone I trusted gave me up. Someone I followed into hell left me there." The room went dead silent. Elijah's voice faltered, then returned, weaker now as if he were lying in dirt, recording with the last ounces of strength. "He said we had air support. Said the flank was clear. It wasn't. They pulled back. I stayed, Shadow stayed. I held on for as long as I could, but I knew I wouldn't make it. If you're hearing this, Dad, I'm sorry I didn't come home. But I need you to know it wasn't an accident. He made sure I'd—" The audio distorted briefly, then cleared again. "His name is Troy Maddox." There it was. The full name. Spoken with broken resolve but unmistakable. Troy's face drained of color. His hands trembled. The courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't gasp or shout. It simply froze. And in that stillness, Malik bowed his head. One hand pressed against his chest, the other reaching blindly for the bench. A tear slid silently down his cheek, disappearing into his graying beard. The judge looked shaken. The prosecutor closed his eyes for a long moment, then opened them with steel in his gaze. The defense attorney stood quickly. "Your Honor, we request to save it," the judge interrupted. "That audio will be submitted into the record. Court is adjourned for 1 hour while we verify the file's metadata and authenticity. But based on what we've heard..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Shadow remained still. Not triumphant, not tense, just watchful. Malik placed his hand gently over the dog's back. "You carried him," he whispered, "all this time." But even as those words left his lips, something else began to stir in his chest. A question. The recording had been hidden on Troy's person. Why carry it now after all these years? Why risk discovery in open court? It wasn't arrogance. It was fear. And fear only shows itself when someone knows there's more to come. As the crowd began to murmur and the bailiffs guided Troy back to holding, Shadow didn't take his eyes off the man. Not for a second. Because deep inside, beneath the rage and the ruin, something in Shadow knew. The courtroom remained suspended in silence long after the recording had ended and the recess had been called. But Malik did not move from his seat. Shadow sat pressed close to his leg, motionless but ever alert, and in the weight of the silence between them, Malik felt it a presence. A message not of peace but of unfinished battle. And when Shadow lifted his head to meet Malik's gaze, what passed between man and dog was no longer just shared grief. It was a reckoning, a vow. And Malik, though exhausted, recognized the old gleam in the dog's eyes. The same look Elijah once had when a decision had been made and there was no turning back. So later that night, back home, when Malik sat at the kitchen table, the rain finally giving way to a wind that rattled the loose gutters, Shadow rose from his place near the door and approached slowly, then sat beside him, leaned in, and tilted his head back, exposing the underside of his neck with a subtle, unmistakable invitation. And Malik froze. The realization hitting like a sudden gasp of breath. Something was there, something buried, not metaphorically, not in memory or pain, but literally, physically, beneath the skin. And with trembling hands, Malik gently ran his fingers along the thick fur at Shadow's throat until he felt it. A ridge, no longer inflamed but unmistakable. A tiny surgical scar hidden beneath fur that had grown over years. And he whispered, "What did they do to you, boy?" His voice shaking not with fear, but with the terrible weight of understanding. Because whatever it was, it had been there all along, traveling with them, silent and dormant, waiting for its moment. And without wasting another minute, Malik called the one person he knew would understand the gravity of this. Dr. Claire Monroe, a retired military veterinarian who once served with Elijah's unit in field operations, and had treated both soldiers and service animals in conditions where trust was the only currency. And when she arrived just before midnight, still in boots and a field jacket despite her civilian status. She didn't ask questions. She simply looked into Shadow's eyes, then at Malik, then nodded solemnly. "Lay him down gently," she said, and Malik obeyed, placing a thick blanket on the living room floor as Shadow lay calmly, tail resting still, watching them both, and Claire put on gloves, disinfected her tools, and with swift, careful precision, made a small incision along the scar. And as she worked, she muttered softly, "Standard military microchip implants are placed in the flank." And when she extracted the tiny black device, no larger than a rice grain but smooth and oddly matte, she connected it to a handheld reader that flickered to life with a military boot screen and began to scroll lines of encrypted text. Then a map interface loaded, blinking red points tracing across Iraq's western border. Fallujah, Ramadi, and then, startlingly, stateside locations lit up: storage units, warehouses, even coordinates that pointed directly to the nav. And Claire's hand paused over the device, eyes wide. "This is tactical data," she murmured, "and encrypted logs. Audio, video, location trails. Holy hell, this thing's a black box." And Malik leaned closer as the screen began playing back fragments Elijah's voice from missions. Mission briefings over comms, conversations in the dark between soldiers, some calm, others in panic, and one clear segment featuring Elijah speaking in a hushed voice. "They're moving the dogs. Not for training, something else. Troy's setting up another ring stateside. It's not just about control, it's money. It's cover." And if then static, followed by a different voice, one Malik didn't recognize, deep and calm. "We'll bury this, no one asks questions. The handler's expendable, the dog's the asset." And Claire stiffened at that, jaw tightening. "He knew," she whispered. "Your son knew what they were doing and they silenced him, but they forgot one thing." She looked down at Shadow, who was now watching her. "They forgot the dog survived." And Malik sat back, overcome, because the realization was staggering. Shadow had not only survived a deadly ambush, he had carried within him the last testimony of Elijah, the actual data no one had ever been meant to find. And he had done it silently, for years, waiting, guarding, moving through a world that had no idea it was standing beside living evidence. And Claire stood, pacing now, the device in hand. "This is enough to open an entirely different case file," she said. "And if what's on here connects to those coordinates, we're looking at an operation that never shut down." Malik nodded slowly, the room spinning as past and present collapsed into each other. The image of the boy in the warehouse resurfacing, the maps, the names, the voice that said handlers expendable, and he realized with sick clarity that Troy wasn't acting alone, and perhaps wasn't even the top of the chain. He had simply been the one exposed first. And there were others, hidden behind layers of fake names, military contracts, shadow budget, people who had kept the operation breathing long after it should have been buried. And Shadow, lying calmly in the center of the room, seemed to sense the shift in energy, the way everyone's pulse quickened. And when Malik looked into those deep, dark eyes again, he saw no fear, only a quiet readiness, as if to say, "We're not done yet." The courtroom on the following morning buzzed with restrained anticipation. Not the kind born of curiosity, but the quiet tension that rises when people realize they are no longer witnessing a trial, they are witnessing the unraveling of a system. And when the doors opened, and Malik stepped in with Shadow at his side, the entire chamber seemed to tilt toward them, as if pulled by the gravity of what they carried. And though Shadow walked without a leash, who had seen enough now to know this animal moved not on command, but on purpose. The judge entered moments later, face drawn tight with the weight of the evidence now under review, especially the encrypted data extracted from the chip within Shadow's neck. And after the oath was given and seats were taken, the prosecutor stood and said plainly, "Your Honor, we would like to introduce a new witness, previously unidentified but whose name appears multiple times in the metadata attached to the recovered microchip." The judge nodded. "Proceed." The rear doors opened again, and a young man stepped inside, barely in his 20s, thin, shoulders tight beneath an oversized jacket, his eyes scanning the room like a hunted thing searching for exits. But when his gaze met Shadow's, something inside him steadied, as though the dog's presence reminded him he wasn't entirely alone. The court clerk asked his name for the record. "Private Mason Vega," he replied, voice fairly above a whisper. The prosecutor leaned forward. Mr. Vega, according to the data found on the device embedded in this canine's body, you were present at Fob 7 in Fallujah during the same operations that involved Corporal Elijah Thompson and the defendant, Troy Maddox. Is that correct? Mason nodded. Yes, sir. And you were listed as missing on an internal document filed 3 weeks after the Fallujah mission. Can you tell us why? Mason exhaled, trembling slightly. Because I ran. I was supposed to disappear, but not how they planned. Explain, the prosecutor said gently. Mason glanced toward Troy, then back at the judge. He was fresh, only a few months in. I got pulled into something I didn't understand. There was this ring, not just training, dogs being used for off-book things, fights, transfers, black market sales. But they didn't want anyone keeping records, so they had us sign NDAs, ones that weren't legal, just threats dressed up like paperwork. The courtroom was frozen now. Even the defense table had gone still. Horseman kill a dog. Said it was too weak. I saw him fake a malfunction in the equipment to cover up how Elijah got pinned. And when Elijah found out more, when he started saving backups, they marked him. I overheard it. They said he was going to be a liability, a loose end. The prosecutor's voice tightened. Did you say anything then? No, Mason admitted, voice cracking. I was scared. Troy, he cornered me, said if I testified no one would ever find me. He said he'd make it look like I went AWOL. Then one night I heard movement near my tent. I was drugged. When I came to, I was tied up outside the perimeter. I don't know how long I was there. But I remember the dog. What dog? Shadow, Mason said. He found me, untied me, led me through the ravine back to the supply truck. He never left my side. I kept low for months after that, hid out in old military shelters, used burner phones. But I kept everything I had. Audio Elijah gave me, logs, even a list of names. I couldn't delete them. I couldn't pretend it never happened. The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowed. You're saying you possess corroborating evidence of coordinated criminal activity involving the defendant, including obstruction of justice and conspiracy to commit murder? Yes, Your Honor, Mason replied, his voice to the prosecutor's office this morning. They matched the chip. The room remained eerily quiet. No one dared speak. The judge glanced toward the clerk, then to the prosecutor. Is this true? The prosecutor nodded. The files confirm encrypted segments we decrypted overnight. Mason Vega's name appears on 16 distinct records. The log entries include time-stamped coordinates, voice memos from Elijah, and internal memos signed by Maddox. The judge sat back. In that case, I am formally elevating the charges against. This trial is no longer a matter of individual assault or negligence. It is now a criminal investigation into conspiracy to commit murder, tampering with evidence, and organized illegal operations involving military personnel and federal resources. Gasps erupted, but the gavel slammed once hard. Silence. Troy Maddox didn't react at first. He sat like a man whose skeleton had been quietly removed, head bowed, breath shallow. But when Shadow rose to his feet and turned to face him, something broke. Troy looked up, face pale, lips trembling. I didn't mean for it to go that far, he mumbled. They said he was making it complicated. He was going to leak it all. Malik stood slowly, not in anger but in gravity, as if drawn upward by something undeniable. He looked at Troy, then at Mason, then down at Shadow, who remained still. It wasn't complicated, Malik said. He was doing the right thing. Mason's hands gripped the edge of the witness stand, knuckles white. He died for it, he said, voice cracking. And I've lived with that silence for years. But I'm done hiding. The judge nodded slowly. So are we. He banged the gavel once more. We will reconvene this trial under amended charges. I am ordering federal review and opening an inquiry into all known associates of the defendant connected to the Redstone and FOB 7 incidents. Bail is revoked. This court is not blind anymore. Shadow sat down, tail still, ears forward. The courtroom didn't cheer. It didn't clap. It simply exhaled collectively, as if permission had finally been granted to breathe truth into the space where lies once festered. Malik reached down, hand resting on Shadow's shoulder. The dog leaned in, just slightly enough to say, "This isn't finished yet," because they both knew truth wasn't justice. Not yet. By the time the court reconvened the following week, The media presence outside the Jackson County Courthouse had transformed the street into a swarm of lenses, microphones, and murmured questions. But inside the walls of that heavy wooden courtroom, something entirely different hung in the air: reverence. A hush that came not from orders but from instinct, the kind that filled churches before eulogies and battlefields before final charges. And as the crowd settled and the judge returned to the bench, the case now formally shifted from criminal negligence to organized federal conspiracy. The courtroom doors opened one final time to allow Malik Thompson to step forward, not as a grieving father or quiet observer, but as a man prepared to speak for those who never could again. And when he took his place at the center podium, every voice stilled. Even the clattering keys of the stenographer paused for a second too long, and then, beside him, not leashed or commanded, but by choice, Shadow lay down at his feet, his head resting gently against Malik's boot, tail unmoving, ears relaxed, not alert as before, but present, listening, waiting. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Thompson," he said gently, "you've requested to speak before closing statements?" Malik nodded. "Yes, Your Honor," the judge gestured. "You may proceed." Malik took a breath, not shallow, not rushed, but slow, as if every word he was about to say had been aged inside him for years, and was only now ready to be poured. "I buried my son without a body," he began, his voice steady but weighted with sorrow. "The military gave me a flag, a letter, a summary, but they never gave me the truth." He looked out over the room, his gaze sweeping across rows of silent jurors, officers, even Troy Maddox, who now sat sunken into his chair like a man waiting to drown. "For 4 years, Malik continued, "I asked questions. For 4 years they told me to let it go, that Elijah had died a soldier's death, that was a lie." His hand drifted instinctively to the back of Shadow's neck, fingers resting gently over the scar now stitched and healing. "The stalk," Malik said, "was with my son, in that hell. He survived when no one else did. He carried the things no one else dared to. In his silence he brought forth voices, truth, memory." He paused, looking down at Shadow, who hadn't moved. "I lost my son," Malik said, softer now, "and when I did, I lost the sound of his voice, the rhythm of his footsteps in our house, the way he laughed when I told him his mother's recipes were better than MRE's. I lost all of that, and I thought I lost my ability to speak with it. Because when grief stays long enough, it stops being pain, it becomes silence." He turned back to the courtroom, standing taller now. "But this dog," he said again, "this dog refused silence. He barked at injustice. He uncovered lies hidden in court benches. He found children buried in forgotten warehouses. And when everyone else turned away, he stared the truth in the eye." Shadow stirred slightly, his tail shifting once like a heartbeat. Malik continued, "My son can't testify, but this dog has. In every step he took, every place he returned to, every item he unearthed, he's told us what happened, and more importantly, he told us who we became by letting it happen." The judge leaned forward slightly, hands folded. The room remained still. Malik stepped away from the podium now, moving toward the defense table slowly, deliberately. He didn't raise his voice. "Troy Maddox," he said, "I don't speak for the court. I don't speak for the prosecution. I speak for the father you stole from, for the soldier you left to die. I'm not here for vengeance. I'm not even here for justice. I'm here because Elijah trusted you, and you made him pay for it. But he wasn't alone, and he wasn't forgotten." He pointed gently down toward Shadow, who now raised his head slightly, watching the man who once lived. "This dog followed Elijah through the desert, through betrayal, through silence. And when Elijah fell, he kept going, not because someone told him to, but because something inside him couldn't stop. You ran from the truth, Troy. He carried it." Troy didn't speak. His eyes were wet but empty, staring through Malik like glass. Malik returned to the podium. "We tell ourselves that heroes are loud, that they fight with flags and speeches and medals. But sometimes heroes walk on 4 legs. But I ask you, let this court recognize the truth that has been dragged back into the light, not by lawyers or detectives, but by a dog who refused to forget." A pause. Then, "My son is gone, and with him I lost my voice. But this dog—" The judge sat back, visibly moved, and for a moment it seemed no one would speak again. But as the silence lingered, the court reporter's hands resumed their typing, and the wheels of the system creaked forward, slowly, inevitably. In that moment, something shifted, not loud, not grand, but enough. Recognition did not come in the form of ceremony, but in the way eyes softened around the room, the way heads dipped slightly toward Shadow, toward Malik, as if acknowledging not only the testimony that had just been delivered, but the witness who had delivered it. Then, from the back of the room, the clerk rose and whispered something to the bailiff, who turned to the judge with a note. The judge read it, eyes narrowing slightly. "We've just received new material," he said. "Intercepted documents from a secure channel flagged during the federal review. It appears the cover-up extended further than previously thought." The courtroom held its breath in the minutes that followed the clerk's whisper and the judge's quiet announcement. For what had begun as a singular criminal trial had evolved into a reckoning, a slow-burning revelation that exposed not just the culpability of one man, but the rot that had spread far beneath the surface. And as the judge reviewed the newly submitted documents, intercepted communications from Redstone's off-book satellite office, memos that named more than just Troy Maddox, that implicated multiple contractors, senior officers, and even a few federal auditors, the air seemed to thin, as if the very walls themselves strained to contain what was now undeniable. And yet through it all, Shadow remained unmoving at Malik's side, his head lowered, body still, as if sensing that this battle, so long fought in silence and instinct, was nearing his final chapter. And when the judge finally removed his reading glasses and set the papers down with care, every person in the room leaned forward a fraction, sensing the moment approaching like a storm building just beyond the frame. In light of the overwhelming evidence, the judge began, his voice deep, solemn, measured, and in acknowledgement of both this court's findings and the federal inquiry now underway, this court formally finds the defendant, Troy Maddox, guilty on all charges: conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, illegal trafficking of military assets, and perjury under oath. A shiver passed through the room, yet no one spoke, no one clapped. Given the weight of these crimes and the irreparable harm done to both individuals and institutions, this court sentences the defendant to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel came down once, a single resonant echo, then silence. No cheers, no relief, just stillness, the kind that follows a war where victory feels like exhaustion more than triumph. Troy sat slumped, lips pressed together, eyes unfocused, a man unmoored from every lie he'd built a life upon. His lawyer said nothing. There were no appeals, no pleas, only the rustle of paper, the distant hum of fluorescent lights, and the faint thump of a heartbeat shared between Malik and the dog beside him. Then, after a long moment, Shadow shifted. He rose slowly, stretching his front paws before settling once more beside Malik. Then, in one fluid motion, he nudged Malik's elbow, tilted his head, and gently licked the back of the man's hand. It wasn't theatrical, it wasn't loud, but it was everything. The room exhaled. First one person stood, an elderly woman from the back bench. Then another, a soldier in uniform, spine stiff but eyes wet. Then a young court officer, his voice cracked but steady, clapping his hands together once, twice. Then others joined, until the entire courtroom was on its feet, applauding not for vengeance, not for spectacle, but for a creature that had borne the truth on 4 legs through hell, and brought it home without a single word. Malik didn't rise. He remained seated, overwhelmed, his hands still outstretched as Shadow rested his head beneath it. For a moment he closed his eyes. In that darkness he could almost hear Elijah's voice again, not in pain, not in fear, but in the quiet calm he used to carry before deployment, when he'd lean against the doorway and say, "Dad, don't worry, I've got someone watching my It was reverent, a rhythm of release and gratitude, echoing from the benches to the ceiling like a hymn, and through it all Shadow simply remained, as he was calm, still, as if the room wasn't clapping for him, but for what he represented. For loyalty that didn't break, for memory that never faded, for the soldier he had followed into fire, and the man he had returned to when all else was ash. The judge stood but did not gavel the room to order. Instead, he allowed the applause to ride its natural course, until finally the room quieted once again. Softer now, quieter. A sacred hush after the roar. The bailiffs approached Troy, who rose mechanically, hands bound, led through the side door. Malik finally stood. He didn't speak, didn't need to. He simply looked down at Shadow, nodded once, and they turned together, walking back down the aisle not as victims or survivors, but as truth-bearers. The crowd parted without instruction. Reporters in the hall lowered their cameras. Veterans saluted. And somewhere behind them, someone whispered that dog carried the soul of a soldier all the way home. But Malik didn't turn. He walked forward, his gait slow, strong, purposeful. Shadow matching him step for step. No leash between them, no command given. Only a bond that could never be replicated, only understood. Outside, the late afternoon light had softened. The wind had quieted. And as they stepped down the courthouse stairs, the same ones Malik had climbed so many weeks before, holding an empty leash, now he held nothing in his hands because the only thing that mattered had already spoken. It had been 32 days since the sentence, since the last gavel fell and the final name was carved into the record of wrongs righted not by procedure, but by perseverance. And in that short stretch of time, the world outside had moved on in ways both expected and painfully indifferent. Headlights faded, press trucks vanished, and the courthouse steps stood empty once more. But for Malik Thompson, the quiet that followed was not one of peace, but of a different kind of service. And so he packed up the small home he'd once shared with a family now only alive in memory, and drove north, far into the folds of the Appalachian Ridge, where cell towers grew sparse, and the land remembered stillness, the way city streets never could. And there, nestled between weathered pine and fog-wrapped cliffs, he found an old ranger's outpost, long abandoned, its fencing rusted and windows fractured by time, and with calloused hands and the silent company of a German shepherd who had once carried the weight of a war, Malik rebuilt it, piece by piece, not for himself, but for those who might come after. The cabin walls rose first, followed by a single flagpole, then a fence rebuilt not to keep danger out, but to keep purpose in. And by the time the first snow dusted the edges of the trail, Malik had already welcomed the first two children, or fragile neglect, foster systems that failed, parents who vanished into drugs or prisons or nowhere at all, and they arrived with nothing but duffel bags and stares too old for their years. But Shadow met each of them at the gate, nose low, tail slow, a guardian who didn't ask for trust but earned it through quiet consistency. Malik taught them structure not through commands but through rhythm. Chores that built self-respect, drills that emphasized presence not punishment. And on weekends they hiked together through the canyons and ravines, Malik with his pack, the children trailing behind, and Shadow at the lead, nose to the wind, ears twitching with every shift in the wood. They learned to listen not just to orders, but to silence, to instinct, to each other. Around the fire at night, Malik shared stories, never beginning with once upon a time, but always real, grounded, sometimes painful. He spoke of loyalty as a compass, of betrayal as a shadow that never quite disappeared, and of love as something worth fighting for, even if it meant losing everything else. And always, always, he spoke of Elijah not as a martyr, not as a soldier, but as a boy who once asked his father how to be brave, and who later showed the world the answer. The children listened. Shadow lay beside the fire, his body a rhythm of breath and patience, his eyes closing only when he was certain no one needed him awake. One morning early in March, Malik took Shadow back to the place he hadn't been in over a year, Greenwood Veterans Cemetery, the hill above the valley, where rows of white stone glimmered under the rising sun. And there, at the far end beneath an oak tree that bent slightly as if bowing, lay the headstone marked Elijah T. Thompson CPL, USMC, beloved son. And without command or hesitation, Shadow walked ahead, paused beside the grave, and slowly laid down, curling his body against the stone, resting one paw gently atop its base. Malik stood behind him, silent, watching, hands tucked into his jacket, breath misting in the early air. He didn't cry. He didn't speak, but his chest ached with the fullness of something sacred and raw. He pulled from his bag a small frame and placed it in the soil beside the stone, anchoring it upright with care. Inside was a photograph taken the week after the trial, captured by one of the kids with an old Polaroid they'd found in the attic. In the image, Shadow lay at Elijah's grave, paw outstretched, his eyes half closed, the wind tugging at his fur. Below the image, printed in careful black ink, were the words, "You didn't need to speak. I still heard." Malik stepped back, hands at his sides. Shadow rose, shook the dew from his coat, and returned to his side. Together they left the hill. Back at the outpost, a new boy had arrived. Younger than the others, skittish, barely speaking. Malik watched as Shadow approached the child slowly, then sat beside him without expectation, simply present, and the boy, after long hesitation, placed a hand on Shadow's back. It wasn't much, but it was everything. That evening, Malik wrote in a notebook he kept near his bedside. A quiet ritual he'd started since the trial ended, not journal entries, not exactly, but fragments of thought, of memory. Letters to Elijah he knew would never be mailed. He wrote, "Some dogs bark, some fight, but the rare ones, they listen, they hold things in their chest until the world is ready to hear them. And when they speak, it changes everything." He closed the notebook, placed it beside a worn picture frame of Elijah in uniform, Shadow beside him as a younger, smaller pup. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. Inside, the fire glowed steady. Malik leaned back, eyes drifting toward sleep. Shadow curled nearby, his chest rising, and in the silence there was peace. Not complete, not perfect, but enough. The kind of peace earned not through verdicts, but through truth told at last. And in the morning they would rise again, not to fight, but to teach, to build, to carry forward a name no longer whispered in pain, but spoken aloud with honor. Elijah, still present, still heard. If this story moved you, take a moment to like and subscribe. It helps more than you know. Which part of the story hit you the hardest? Was it when Shadow returned to the courtroom, or when he laid at Elijah's grave one last time? Tell me where you're watching from and share your favorite moment in the comments. I'd love to hear what stayed with you.